The candidate advances down the hallway. His steps echo in the medieval castle, 4 towers visible from outside, a moat surrounding it all. Inside, the darkness is almost total. He enters an immense hall upholstered in black. The chandeliers are unlit. In the dimness of the wall lamps, he begins to make out forms, bodies wrapped in shrouds. They move in silence. They leave behind them a smell of putrefaction. In the center of the hall, there is an altar built with human bones. 2 of the figures approach. They tie a blood-stained pink ribbon around his forehead. They hang a crucifix and an amulet around his neck. They tear off his clothes. They paint crosses on his naked body with blood. They tie his genitals with a thread. 5 more figures throw themselves to the ground in a position of supplication. Suddenly, a funeral pyre is lit. The candidate's clothes are thrown into the flames. From the fire, a great form seems to emerge. A deep voice speaks with an authority impossible to locate. The candidate repeats the words of the oath. "In the name of the crucified one, I swear to break all the bonds that unite me to mother, brothers, sisters, wife, relatives, friends, kings, superiors, benefactors, or any other man to whom I have promised faith, service, or obedience." The oath continues. It includes acceptance of the use of aqua tofana, a poison to eliminate those who oppose the truth. It includes the promise to reveal everything the initiate has heard or discovered. It includes the warning that a dagger will reach him, wherever he may be, if he betrays his initiation. At the end, a 7-branched candelabrum with 7 black candles is placed before the candidate beside a vessel with human blood. The candidate washes in it, drinks from it. This scene was documented in 1789 by the writer Jean-Pierre Louis de Luchet in his Essai sur la secte des Illuminés, based on an initiation that occurred at the Château d'Ermenonville on the outskirts of Paris. It is not fiction or an urban legend. It is the historical record of a society that, according to its own documents confiscated by the Bavarian police, had access to deadly poisons, lethal gases, invisible inks, forged government seals, and lists of the most powerful names in Europe. Its name was the Order of the Illuminati of Bavaria. Its founder was a 30-year-old law professor, and his plan was to change the entire world. The question that persists 2 centuries later is not whether they existed, it is whether they ever disappeared. The origin of Illuminati symbolism and ideology goes back 6,000 years, when between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the first great known civilization arose, Sumer. What archaeologists unearthed in the 19th century in the mounds of southern Iraq was not only a primitive civilization, but a society with sexagesimal base mathematics, the same one we use today to measure time with the zodiac, with the first solar calendar, with a legal system that preceded the Code of Hammurabi, with irrigation canals and ziggurats that remain monumental. More than 500,000 fired clay tablets have been recovered. Only 20% has been translated. What those tablets say is disturbing for conventional history. The Sumerians claimed not to have invented their civilization. They claimed to have received it from beings who came from the heavens, whom they called Anunnaki, those who descended from heaven to earth. Regardless of how that claim is interpreted, what is historically traceable is the chain of transmission of knowledge that began in Sumer. The biblical patriarch Abraham was, according to the texts, a Sumerian nobleman from the city of Ur in ancient Chaldea, what is today Iraq. It was he who took that encoded knowledge to Egypt, where it was deposited in texts such as the Sefer Yetzirah and the Sefer HaZohar. From Egypt, the knowledge passed to the mystery schools of Greece, from Greece to Rome, from Rome to the first centuries of Christianity. In all these stages, there was one constant. Knowledge was guarded by a priestly elite. It was not for everyone. Whoever had access to it had power. That was always the business of secret societies. The mystery schools of antiquity, the Gnostics, persecuted by the early church, the Jewish Kabbalists, the Neoplatonists of Alexandria, all guarded fragments of what seemed to be the same body of knowledge. And all were persecuted by the institutions of official power, whether the Roman Empire, the Catholic Church, or the medieval kings. Repression, paradoxically, was what created the network. Forced to operate in secret, these groups developed systems of encrypted communication, hierarchies of initiation, oaths of silence, cellular structures where no one knew more than necessary. They invented, in essence, the organizational architecture that Adam Weishaupt would copy centuries later. And before reaching Weishaupt, the most important link is one that almost no one knows: the Gnostics. The Gnostics believed they had direct access to divinity without needing priestly intermediaries. Their cosmology was radically different from that of Catholicism. The God of the Old Testament was, for them, an inferior entity, even malevolent, who kept human beings in ignorance. The true divine principle was unreachable for the majority, but accessible to those who attained gnosis, initiatory knowledge. The Church declared them heretics. The historian Irenaeus of Lyon persecuted them with writings. Roman power massacred them when the Church became the official religion. They survived underground, and their theology, under different names, would reappear centuries later at the heart of the Illuminati. The threads that connect Sumer with Bavaria in 1776 pass through three historical institutions, without which the Illuminati are incomprehensible: the Templars, the Rosicrucians, and the Freemasons. In 1099, the Crusaders took Jerusalem. A year later, a group of 9 French knights requested permission from the king to settle in the stables built over the ruins of the Temple of Solomon on the Temple Mount. The king accepted them. For almost a decade, they did nothing visible. What they did was excavate. When the Templars emerged from that period of apparent inactivity, they had money, influence, and knowledge that no group of knights without previous resources should have had. The hypothesis most sustained by historians is that they found something beneath the ruins of the temple, possibly part of the treasure of Solomon, possibly documents containing the knowledge that the priests of the temple had hidden from the Romans when they destroyed Jerusalem in the year 70 AD. The Templars built with that capital, whatever it was, the most sophisticated banking system of the Middle Ages, their own maritime fleet, a communications network that crossed Europe, and some of the most extraordinary buildings of the medieval era, including the Gothic cathedrals, whose architectural technology appeared without known precedents. They traveled farther than any other European institution of their time. There is material evidence of Templar presence in Nova Scotia 4 centuries before Columbus. On October 13, 1307, a Friday, King Philip IV of France and Pope Clement V coordinated the simultaneous arrest of Templars throughout Europe. The official documents accused them of heresy, sodomy, and worship of an idol called Baphomet. Under torture, many confessed. The last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was burned alive in 1314, but according to the internal tradition of Freemasonry, he cast a curse upon the king and the Pope from the flames. Both died before the year ended. The order was suppressed, but its members did not disappear. Many took refuge in Scotland, where King Robert the Bruce, excommunicated by the Church, welcomed them. Their doctrines infiltrated the guilds of medieval builders, and through them, what would eventually become operative masonry that became speculative. When the Grand Lodge of Freemasonry was formed in London in 1717, much of the Templar ritual and symbolism was already embedded in its degrees. The Rosicrucians, for their part, claimed a line of transmission of knowledge that went back to Egypt. Tradition attributed their foundation in 1188 to a Templar knight named Jean de Gisors, vassal of King Henry II of England. Historically documented since the 17th century, their manifestos proclaimed the possession of a secret knowledge of nature capable of transforming society and the individual. The Church persecuted them. Repression made them more hermetic. By the second half of the 18th century, the dividing line between Templars, Rosicrucians, and Masons was so faint that the different organizations seemed variations on the same theme. They shared symbolism, hierarchical structure, oaths of silence, and the claim to an ancient wisdom that official religion had attempted to suppress. In that universe, saturated with esotericism, a young Bavarian professor named Adam Weishaupt was going to introduce something radically new, a political plan: Ingolstadt, Bavaria, 1748. The city was an enclave of Jesuit control in the heart of Catholic Germany. The University of Ingolstadt, founded 300 years earlier, was governed by the Society of Jesus, an order whose military structure, whose network of informants, and whose chain of blind obedience had been designed expressly to stop the Protestant Reformation. Adam Weishaupt was born there on February 6th of that year. His father was, according to several sources, a Kabbalist rabbi. He died when Adam was 5 years old. The boy was sent to live with his godfather, Baron Johann Adam Freiherr von Ickstadt, professor of law at the university, and a man linked to the enlightened circles that sought to free Bavaria from Jesuit control. Ickstadt opened his private library to him. There were Rousseau, Voltaire, Diderot, the thinkers who formed the core of the movement known as the Enlightenment. There were also the texts forbidden by the Jesuits, works on the ancient mysteries, on Hermeticism, on the pagan practices that the Church had demonized for centuries. At the age of 7, Weishaupt was enrolled in a Jesuit school. During the following years, he had constant problems with his teachers because of his opinions and his love for free expression. At 20, he graduated with a doctorate in law. He converted to Protestantism despite his Catholic formation. In 1772, at the age of 24, he became a professor of law. 3 years later, in 1775, he was appointed Professor of Canon Law, a position that until then had only been occupied by Jesuits. The Society of Jesus had been dissolved by Pope Clement XIV in 1773, but it continued to control the university de facto. Weishaupt was the only layman in a faculty dominated by former Jesuits who detested him. In his apartments, he began to gather students and colleagues to discuss what the Jesuits forbade. Ancient philosophy, the Eleusinian and Mithraic mysteries of Greece and Rome, the mathematics of Pythagoras. According to some sources, those meetings included alcohol, music, and cannabis use. A 1969 article pointed out that Weishaupt had studied the methods of Hassan bin Sabbah, founder of the medieval assassins, and that he had reached illumination through hashish. The motto the order would adopt, Eeuwige Blumenkraft, or Eternal Flower Power, was a psychedelic anticipation of the 60s of the 20th century. He was initiated into Freemasonry in 1777, but found that the Masons did not seem to understand the hidden meaning of their own ceremonies. The rituals were repeated without understanding. The knowledge had been emptied. He decided to create something of his own. On May 1st, 1776, a date that in the pagan tradition marked the beginning of spring and that socialists and communists would adopt as International Workers' Day, Adam Weishaupt and 4 law students signed the statutes of the Order of the Perfectibilists. The name soon changed. In April 1778, the organization adopted its definitive name, Ordo Illuminati Bavarensis, the Order of the Illuminati of Bavaria. The 5 founders were Franz Anton von Massenhausen, Max Edler von Merz, Andreas Suto, a man named Bauhoff, and Weishaupt himself, who took the code name Spartacus. The declared goal was the abolition of all monarchical governments and state religions in Europe, and the return to a humanist thought based on reason. What none of them could imagine that afternoon in Ingolstadt was that 12 years later their ideas would have crossed the Atlantic, would have set Paris ablaze, and would have set in motion a process that still has not ended. A year after founding the order, Weishaupt joined the Masonic Lodge Theodore of Good Counsel in Munich. He found there what he was looking for, an already established network with oaths of silence, with members in positions of power, with the infrastructure of a continental organization. The strategy was simple. The Illuminati were not going to compete with Freemasonry. They were going to infiltrate it. The true leap came in 1780 when Weishaupt recruited Baron Adolf Franz Friedrich Ludwig Knigge. He was a well-connected nobleman in the courts of Hesse-Kassel and Weimar, a high-ranking Mason in the rite of strict observance, tireless traveler, born recruiter, and a man with an organizational capacity that Weishaupt never had. Where the founder was a theorist of hidden knowledge, Knigge was a political strategist. It was Knigge who transformed the order from a university fraternity into a machine of continental power. His first great act was to create the higher degrees of the order. The structure he designed had 3 main classes. The first was the Minerval class, with 3 degrees of its own, from the Novitiate to the Illuminatus Minor. The second was the Masonic class, which incorporated the 3 symbolic degrees of Freemasonry. The third, the Greater Mysteries, was accessible only to the inner circle, divided into the degrees of priest, prince, and regent, and culminating in the 2 highest degrees, Magus and Rex. In each degree, the candidate received new doctrines. In the lower degrees, people spoke of virtue, reason, and personal improvement. Only in the higher degrees did the initiate discover the true objectives of the order, the destruction of all monarchy and all organized religion, and the establishment of a global government based on the principles of Illuminism. Each member had a code name taken from classical antiquity. Weishaupt was Spartacus. Knigge was Philo. His second-in-command, Franz Xaver von Zwack, was Cato. The communication system used a Persian calendar and renamed geography. Bavaria was Achaia, Munich was Athens, Ingolstadt was Eleusis. Members had to keep detailed diaries with their most intimate thoughts, their daily experiences, their social relationships. Those diaries were periodically handed over to their superiors. It was, in essence, the first modern system of total surveillance within an organization. Whoever had access to those diaries had power of blackmail over his own members. Reports flowed upward, but knowledge flowed downward only in controlled doses. No one knew more than he needed to know. It was the same principle that Lenin would use to build the Bolshevik Party, and that the CIA would use in the 20th century under the concept of compartmentalization. The network grew rapidly. Second year, 12 members. Fifth year, more than 300. By 1784, almost 3,000 initiates, including the Dukes of Brunswick, Gotha and Weimar, intellectuals such as Johann Wolfgang von Goethe and Johann Gottfried Herder, and nobles who controlled armies, courts and diplomatic portfolios throughout Europe. Nigger's second great blow was the Congress of Wilhelmsbad of 1782, convened at the summer residence of William I of Hanau. It was the most important Masonic gathering of the century. There, the Illuminati presented themselves as the only organization capable of guarding the true secrets of the Templars. They managed to have the rite of strict observance dissolved, and its thousands of members became available to be recruited. The French delegate Count de Virieu returned to Paris visibly disturbed. When asked what had happened at the Congress, he replied, "I can only tell you that all this is much more serious than you believe. The conspiracy that is being formed is so elaborate that it will be virtually impossible for the monarchy and the church to escape it." By 1788, almost all the Masonic lodges of Europe were infiltrated by men who subscribed to Illuminism. The headquarters of the movement moved to Frankfurt, financially controlled by a family that had just established its continental banking network. They were called the Rothschilds. Meyer Amschel Bauer was born in 1744 in the Jewish ghetto of Frankfurt. He studied to become a rabbi and was instructed in the Mishnah, an amalgam of Hebrew law and mysticism that contained, according to tradition, secrets transmitted from the Kabbalah. The death of his parents forced him to abandon rabbinical studies and take employment in a banking house. He learned the business quickly. He became financial agent to William IX, administrator of the region of Hesse-Kassel and prominent Mason. He gained his trust by selling ancient coins and art objects at reduced prices. When William IX received from the British government an enormous sum for lending 17,000 Hessian soldiers to fight the American colonists during the Revolution, he handed that money to Bauer so he could invest it. Bauer used part of those funds to establish his son Nathan in London. Nathan Rothschild, with that initial capital, gradually built what by 1815 would be effective control over the Bank of England. He was not the only one. Meyer sent his 5 sons to the 5 largest financial centers of Europe: Amschel to Frankfurt, James to Paris, Salomon to Vienna, Nathan to London, and Karl to Naples. The 5 brothers coordinated their operations, shared privileged information before anyone else had it, and generated, according to their critics, artificial market booms and crashes to maximize profits. Meyer Amschel Bauer changed his surname to Rothschild, Red Shield in German, taken from the symbol of the family house in the ghetto. It was the beginning of a dynasty that by the mid-19th century would be the largest concentration of private wealth in the world. The connection between the Rothschilds and the Illuminati is documented through multiple channels. One of the first members of the order was Count Thaddeus von Thurn und Taxis, whose family administered the postal system of the Holy Roman Empire. This gave them access to all the political and commercial correspondence of the continent. The Rothschilds, famous for their speed of information, had an obvious interest in that network. The historian David Livingstone, citing various sources, argues that in 1773 Meyer Rothschild summoned 12 rich and influential men to finance a project of world domination, and that it was then that he commissioned Weishaupt to found the order. Although this causal chain is difficult to verify documentarily, what is verifiable is that in 1782 the headquarters of Masonic Illuminism moved to Frankfurt, the city of the Rothschilds, and that it was then that for the first time Jews were allowed to join Masonic lodges. The headquarters in Frankfurt also connected the Illuminati with a figure who would add a third dimension to the project: Jacob Frank. Frank was the leader of the Frankists, a Jewish messianic sect derived from the movement of Sabbatai Zevi. Zevi had proclaimed himself the Messiah in 1666, and when the Ottoman Sultan ordered him to choose between death and conversion to Islam, he chose Islam. His followers interpreted that betrayal as a mystical act. Frank continued this tradition of inversion of values. He believed that in order to redeem himself, the human being had to transgress all prohibitions. His followers practiced incest, orgies, and strategic conversion to other religions as a method of infiltration. Frank converted to Catholicism. He instructed his followers to do the same. In Frankfurt, according to Rabbi Marvin Antelman, Frank received financial support from Meyer Rothschild. The alliance generated between the three elements, the Rothschilds' money, Weishaupt's structure, and the networks of the Frankists, produced what Antelman described as the most complete mechanism ever designed for the subversion of all existing religions and governments. The next step was revolutionary. In the most literal sense of the word, the order made the mistake of believing that it was invulnerable. In June 1784, the Bavarian elector Karl Theodor, to whom increasingly serious accusations about the Illuminati had reached, issued a first edict prohibiting all secret societies. The members of the order ignored it, convinced that it was not directed specifically at them. 9 months later, Karl Theodor issued a second edict that explicitly named the Illuminati and certain Masonic lodges. He ordered the confiscation of funds and the end of all activity. But the order had already suffered an internal fracture that accelerated its fall. Nigger and Weishaupt had been in conflict for years. The philosophical differences, the founders' dictatorial style, the eternal shortage of funds, and the rivalry for control of the organization had deteriorated the relationship to the point of no return. In April 1784, Nigger resigned. He signed an agreement returning all the ritual documents of the order, but promising not to reveal its secrets. Without Nigger, the power of the order began to decline. In July 1785, the Illuminati friar Johann Jakob Lanz was struck by lightning while riding with Weishaupt near Regensburg. In Lanz's body, the Bavarian agents found documents of the order, including membership lists with the names of prominent men from all over Europe. Karl Theodor issued a third edict ordering the death penalty for anyone who recruited for the Illuminati. The police raided the house of Franz Xaver von Zwack in Landshut. The spoils were extraordinary. Membership lists, statutes, instructions for recruits, initiation ceremonies, insignia, a proposal to recruit women, government seals for document forgery, instructions for preparing abortive teas, poisons, lethal gases, invisible ink, and a safe that would explore its contents if opened without the correct key. Hundreds of letters about internal affairs of the order, tables with the secret symbols, the geographical codes, and the initiation procedures. The Bavarian government published everything in 2 volumes titled Some Original Writings of the Illuminati Order, and sent them to the governments of England, France, and Russia. But the foreign nobles who had been exposed to Illuminati propaganda still considered them noble and well-intentioned Masons. They could not believe that their true objectives included plans for global revolution. In 1787, Karl Theodor issued a final edict, death penalty for anyone who recruited for the Illuminati. The order, as a formal organization, had ended. In 1785, Weishaupt was dismissed from the University of Ingolstadt and left without accepting the pension they offered him. He took refuge at the court of Duke Ernest II of Saxe-Gotha-Altenburg, a member of the order, who appointed him privy councillor, which placed him beyond the reach of the Bavarian agents. From exile, Weishaupt wrote pamphlets defending Illuminism. He never repented. He died on November 18, 1830, according to official history, as a bitter and forgotten man. Official history, however, was wrong in the essential point, because what the Bavarian elector had suppressed was the structure, not the doctrine. And the doctrine, expelled from Bavaria, began to spread throughout Europe like a fire. The 2 books that contributed most to publicly destroying the reputation of the Illuminati were also the ones that most widely disseminated their doctrines. The Jesuit Augustin Barruel published in 1797 his memoirs illustrating the history of Jacobinism. The Scottish physicist John Robeson published in 1798 proofs of a conspiracy. Both, working independently, reached the same conclusions. The Illuminati had orchestrated the French Revolution. Both books were translated into dozens of languages. They reached all of Europe, America, the entire world. The people who read them in order to be scandalized became, without knowing it, the greatest disseminators of Illuminism. What Barruel and Robertson described in their anti-Illuminati texts, the doctrine that governments are illegitimate, that religions are tools of control, that humanity can and must be reorganized according to rational principles without kings or clerics, was exactly what thousands of readers in Europe and America needed to hear at that historical moment. But before their books reached bookstores, the revolution had already occurred. On July 14, 1789, a crowd took the Bastille in Paris. Popular history presents that day as the spontaneous beginning of a popular rebellion. Historical documents tell a different version. The Duke of Orléans, former Grand Master of French Freemasonry of the Grand Orient, had bought the entire grain harvest of France that year and had sold it abroad or hidden it, creating an artificial famine that stirred up popular discontent. Agitators mounted on horseback traveled through the villages announcing that the aristocrats planned to attack the people. Violence spread. The historian Vernon Stauffer documented that by early 1789, the lodges of the Grand Orient of France had received the secrets of the Illuminati. The Duke of Orléans, illuminated by the Count of Mirabeau, gave his support to the project. In record time, the 266 Masonic lodges, controlled by the Grand Orient, 266 knots of a network that extended throughout France, were coordinated for when the signal arrived. Giuseppe Balsamo, known as Count Alessandro di Cagliostro, magician of the court of Louis XIV, Mason Rosicrucian, and agent of the Illuminati, wrote, "By March 1789, the 266 lodges controlled by the Grand Orient were all illuminated without knowing it, because Masons in general were not told the name of the sect that brought them those mysteries. All the revolutionaries of the Constituent Assembly, without exception, had been initiated into the third degree of Illuminized Masonry. The list includes the Duke of Orléans, Lafayette, Mirabeau, Marat, Robespierre, Danton. Mirabeau himself, in his personal papers, had left written what he intended. It is necessary to destroy every order, every law, every power, to leave the people in anarchy. The people had to be promised real power, but never given it, because the people as legislator are very dangerous. They only establish laws that coincide with their passions. The clergy had to be destroyed by ridiculing religion. And then he added, as if he were repeating the words of Weishaupt himself, "What do the means matter as long as the end is achieved?" The historian Ralph Epperson, after an exhaustive study, wrote, "The invisible hand that guided the entire French Revolution was that of the Illuminati, who had only 13 years of existence, but were already powerful enough to cause a revolution in one of the largest countries in the world." The result was a bloodbath that first devoured its own elites and then hundreds of thousands of citizens. The Jacobins, the direct heirs of Masonic Illuminism, executed King Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, and thousands of aristocrats with the guillotine. The dream of the Illuminati had been fulfilled. The monarchy and the power of the Church in France had been destroyed. General Napoleon Bonaparte put an end to the chaos in 1799 and proclaimed the end of the revolution. France was in ruins, but the experiment had shown that it was possible, that a sufficiently organized group with sufficient penetration into the institutions of a country could overthrow a power established for centuries. The lesson was not lost. When the American colonists rose up against King George III of England, history books present it as a spontaneous popular movement born from the desire for freedom. But there are details that popular history tends to omit. In 1764, King George III, pressured by the Bank of England, which for many researchers was already at that time a Rothschild vehicle, outlawed the American colonial currency and forced the colonies to acquire Bank of England notes by paying interest. Benjamin Franklin wrote that the colonists would have tolerated the tea tax and other levies if England had not taken away their own currency, creating unemployment and misery. The Illuminati, through their Masonic agents, took advantage of that discontent. In 1760, the Illuminist Mason Stephen Morin arrived from France to the colonies and opened dozens of Illuminist lodges in America and the Caribbean. In 1772, Haym Salomon, an agent of the Rothschilds, arrived in the colonies using European money to influence the colonial leaders. Of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence, only one was not a Mason. The Boston Tea Party was entirely Masonic, organized by members of St. Andrew's Lodge. Both George Washington and Thomas Jefferson knew of the existence of the Illuminati and left it in writing. In September 1798, Washington wrote in a letter, "Regarding the doctrine of the Illuminati and the principles of Jacobinism, it is true that both things exist in this country and that they are spreading." Jefferson, for his part, described Weishaupt in his letters as an enthusiastic philanthropist. The most persistent symbol of that link is on the $1 bill. On its reverse appears a pyramid with 13 steps, and above it, floating separate from the body of the pyramid, an eye inside a triangle surrounded by light. The legend Annuit Coeptis, God has favored our undertakings, and beneath the pyramid, Novus Ordo Seclorum, a new order of the ages. The Masonic occultist Manly P. Hall wrote, "Not only were many of the founders of the government of the United States Masons, but they received help from a secret and august body that existed in Europe, and that helped them establish this country for a peculiar and particular purpose known only to the few initiated." And he noted that the Great Seal is the signature of that exalted body, invisible and for the most part unknown. Emanuel Josephson, in a 1955 text, argued that the initials MDCLXXY1 at the base of the pyramid do not commemorate the date of the Declaration of Independence, but the year of the founding of the Illuminati, 1776. The Novus Ordo Seclorum of the American Bill and the New World Order that Weishaupt dreamed of in Ingolstadt were, for many researchers, the same thing expressed in classical Latin. The Illuminati, as a formal organization, had been suppressed in Bavaria in 1787. But their doctrines continued their march under different names. The most obvious destination was communism. Karl Marx, son of a long line of rabbis and undoubtedly familiar with the mystical traditions of the Torah and the Kabbalah, joined in 1847 a secret organization in London called the League of the Just. This league, composed mostly of German emigrants whom many researchers believed were fugitive members of the banned Illuminati, changed its name at the suggestion of Rabbi Moritz Moses Hess, called the Communist Rabbi, to the Communist Party. The Communist Manifesto that Marx and Engels wrote that year was, according to some researchers, produced under instructions from the Masonic leadership. The objectives of the Communist program were, almost point by point, the same as those the Illuminati had proclaimed: abolition of all ordered national governments, of inheritance, of private property, of national sovereignty and patriotism, of the individual home and family life, and of all established religions. In the financial field, the 19th century saw the gradual establishment of national central banks in the main European countries. The Rothschilds were the architects of that process. In 1913, the last bastion, the United States, fell. The story of how the American Federal Reserve was created is one of the most unusual in modern capitalism. In November 1910, a group of men traveled secretly from New Jersey to Jekyll Island in Georgia. To avoid being recognized, they traveled with luggage without names, used only their first names, and presented the excursion as a hunting trip. Among them were Nelson Aldrich, head of the Senate Monetary Commission and father-in-law of John D. Rockefeller Jr., the banker Frank Vanderlip of National City Bank, representative of the Rothschild Rockefeller interests, Henry P. Davison of J.P. Morgan Company, and Paul Warburg, whose brother Max ran the Rothschild banks in Hamburg and Amsterdam. There they designed the central banking system of the United States, which was approved by Congress in 1913 as the Federal Reserve. It was technically a private bank with governmental powers. James Paul Warburg, son of the architect of the system, declared before the Senate in 1950, "We shall have world government, whether we like it or not. The only question is whether it will be achieved by conquest or by consent." Meanwhile, in Europe, another current of history was preparing to change the world again. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria was assassinated in Sarajevo. The assassin, Gavrilo Princip, was, according to a Masonic publication from 1952, a member of Freemasonry. The organizer of the attack, Milan Ciganovic, was the leader of a secret society called the Black Hand and also a Mason. According to statements during the later trials, Ciganovic had admitted that the Masons had not found any brother willing to carry out the assassination, so they turned to the Black Hand. The assassination triggered the First World War. The war, which no one really won except the bankers who financed both sides and the Zionists who obtained Palestine, ended with the Treaty of Versailles. That treaty was designed to be so humiliating for Germany that, as the economist John Maynard Keynes predicted at the very moment it was being signed, it would make another war inevitable. In Russia, meanwhile, the First War had served as cover for another revolution. In 1917, with the Tsar pressured by the war, groups of agitators organized and financed from abroad caused his abdication. Lenin, exiled in Switzerland, traveled through wartime Germany in a sealed train with the consent of the German intelligence service that included Max Warburg, brother of the architect of the Federal Reserve. Trotsky was in New York with an American passport and Wall Street funds and sailed back to Russia accompanied by a group of revolutionaries. The financier Jacob Schiff, whose family had lived with the Rothschilds in Frankfurt, contributed some $20 million to the triumph of Bolshevism in Russia. His grandson John Schiff publicly acknowledged it decades later. The Tsar and his entire family were murdered in July 1918. The telegraph tapes found by the investigators of the White Russians and deciphered in Paris in 1922 revealed, according to the Canadian writer Henry Makow, that the order to assassinate the Tsar and his family came from New York. For the researchers who follow the chain of Illuminism, the Second World War was the next move on the same board. The documents that the Nuremberg Tribunal did not examine because the British judge Airy Neave declared the matter inadmissible were those that showed the connections between Nazism and secret societies. Hitler emerged from the circles of the Thule Society of Munich, a post-First World War occultist organization. Thule claimed to descend from the wisdom of the ancestral Aryan race. Its members practiced ceremonial magic. Dietrich Eckart, its central figure, founded the German Workers' Party, which later became the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi. Eckart was also the first to circulate the Protocols of the Elders of Zion as a reference text for the Jewish conspiracy that, in his view, explained all the evils of the world. What Eckart did not mention, or did not know, was that those protocols had been fabricated by the Tsarist Okhrana based on an original text that, according to Michael Bagant, Richard Lee, and Henry Lincoln in the book The Holy Grail, bore the signature of the representatives of Zion of the 33rd degree. A Masonic signature, not a Jewish one. The protocols, whatever their real origin was, were in essence the program of the Illuminati with the names replaced. The doctrine of the Illuminati needed new organizational structures to survive in modernity. It found them. In 1832, General William Huntington Russell brought from Germany the statutes of a secret society and founded its American chapter at Yale University. He called it Skull and Bones, chapter 322. The number could refer to 322 BC, the year of the death of Demosthenes, or it could be an internal reference to the third part of the second degree of the Illuminati. What Ron Rosenbaum, an Esquire journalist who investigated the society in the 70s, found when examining its rituals was unequivocal. The German motto painted over the arch of the sacred chamber of Yale's tomb building, the headquarters of the society, was identical to the one found in an Illuminati ritual manual confiscated by the Bavarian police in 1785. The Masonic symbols on the walls were the same as those of the German lodges associated with the Illuminati. The initiation structure, where the candidate lies in a coffin, confesses his most intimate sexual secrets before the members and is reborn into the society, was point by point the same process described in Weishaupt's documents. Every year, 15 Yale University students are chosen for the society. A disproportionately high number of them end up in positions of power in government, banking, the media, and the intelligence services. Members include the historian Averell Harriman, 1913, whose bank merged with that of the Bush family to create Brown Brothers Harriman, the publisher Henry Luce, founder of Time and Life, George H.W. Bush, 1948, who was director of the CIA and President of the United States, and his son George W. Bush, 1968, also President. The mixture between Skull and Bones and the CIA is so dense that the Yale historian Gaddis Smith declared, "Yale has influenced the Central Intelligence Agency more than any other university, giving the CIA the atmosphere of an alumni reunion." The Yale slang term for a member of a secret society was spook, the same word the CIA uses for its undercover agents. In parallel, in 1921, the banker J.P. Morgan and John D. Rockefeller founded the Council on Foreign Relations. In 1954, the Bilderberg Group was convened for the first time, whose annual meetings bring together top-level political and business leaders and whose deliberations are secret. In 1973, David Rockefeller and Zbigniew Brzezinski founded the Trilateral Commission at Rockefeller's estate in Pocantico Hills. These three organizations, the CFR, Bilderberg, and the Trilateral, are often pointed to by researchers as the contemporary mechanisms of Illuminism. None allows public admission. Their members are carefully chosen. Their meetings are not public. Their decisions influence global politics without the need for democratic legitimation. David Rockefeller himself, in his memoirs published in 2003, wrote, "Some even believe we are part of a secret cabal that works against the best interests of the United States, characterizing my family and me as internationalists and conspiring with others around the world to build a more integrated global political and economic structure, one world, if you will. If that is the charge, I plead guilty, and I am proud of it." Symbols are the language of secret societies. What cannot be said openly is encoded in stone, paper, and metal. The all-seeing eye above the pyramid on the $1 bill is the eye of Horus, symbol of royal power in ancient Egypt, the eye of the god of the sky and royalty. For the initiates of the mystery schools, it also represented the third eye, the pineal gland, access to higher states of consciousness. The innermost symbol of the Illuminati, the cipher used in all communication among members, was a point inside a circle, the sun radiating illumination to the outer circles. The stepped pyramid on the American bill was the central emblem of the Order's Minerval assemblies, where the unfinished top represented that the work had not yet been concluded. The number 13 appears repeatedly in American iconography. 13 steps on the pyramid, 13 stars above the eagle, 13 stripes on the shield, 13 leaves and 13 berries on the olive branch. 13 were the original colonies, but 13 is also the number of rebellion in occultist numerology. The Owl of Minerva was the original symbol of the Bavarian Illuminati. The initiates of the lower degrees called themselves Brothers of Minerval and met in Minerval assemblies. The same owl is today the symbol of the Bohemian Club of San Francisco, whose members, among whom are counted American presidents, C1AA directors and CEOs of the world's largest corporations, meet every July in the Bohemian Grove in California for a ceremony called the Cremation of Care, where an effigy representing worldly concerns is burned in front of a 9-meter-high cement owl. The music critic Gary Vay documented that the standard musical tuning frequency, 440 Hz, was universally adopted in 1939 at the urging of the Rockefeller Foundation and with the enthusiasm of Goebbels's Nazi propaganda ministry. Before that date, the standard frequency was 432 Hz. The defenders of 432 Hz argue that this frequency resonates with the natural rhythms of the human body, stimulates the right hemisphere of the brain, that of creativity and empathy, and activates what in the Hindu tradition is called the heart chakra. The 440 Hz, according to these researchers, instead produces irritation, aggressiveness, and analytical thinking without emotional dimension, useful characteristics for armies and an industrialized workforce. Regardless of whether this theory is correct, the fact is that the current standard was designed in collaboration among actors associated with the structures of power that we describe. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, a series of people claim to have had internal access to what survived of the Illuminati. Their testimonies are difficult to verify, but they share a disturbing internal consistency. In 1829, a Scottish woman named Frances Wright, associated with the socialist Robert Dale Owen, led a meeting in New York where she spoke of equal rights, atheism, and free love, and where she announced that an international movement based on Illuminati principles was being developed that would be used to provoke future wars. The movement, she said, would be called communism. The writer John Todd, the intelligence officer L. Fletcher Prouty, Rabbi Marvin Antleman, the Canadian journalist Barry Chamish, and dozens of other individuals from different traditions and countries described, with varying degrees of documentation, the same structure. An elite of 33 family lineages organized in a network of secret societies controlling the main central banks with the capacity to create wars and financial crises at will. The anonymous nurse who appeared under the pseudonym Svali described in the year 2000 having worked for years as a programmer and trainer for an organization that operated under the name Illuminati. She said that the organization had 6 chairs on its Council of Ascended Masters: sciences, government, leadership, sciences, spiritual, and military. That her mother was a member of the Regional Council of the Washington, D.C. area and occupied the spiritual chair. A figure called Cisco Wheeler, who claimed to be a descendant of Ulysses Grant through her relative General Earl Wheeler, Chief of Staff during Vietnam, declared in interviews that she had been subjected since before birth to mind control programs designed by Dr. Joseph Mengele, the doctor of the Auschwitz concentration camp. She said that Mengele was brought to the United States under Project Paperclip, the program that recruited Nazi scientists after the Second World War, and that he continued his mind control experiments for the CIA and for the Illuminati elite. These testimonies, taken together and in the context of what is documented that the CIA did develop mind control programs under the name MK Ultra, that the Nazis were indeed recruited under Paperclip, that Mengele did disappear and was never tried, generate questions that official history has not answered. In 2005, a woman named Mimi Eustace published online the recordings of her father Samuel Todd Churchill, a member of a secret Mardi Gras society in New Orleans that, according to Churchill, had direct connections with Skull and Bones and with the House of Rothschild. Among his claims, that the American presidents William Henry Harrison and Zachary Taylor were poisoned by Illuminati agents because they obstructed their plans for the Civil War, and that Confederate Secretary of State Judah Benjamin, an agent of the Rothschilds in New Orleans, was a key actor in the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. President Lincoln, it is worth remembering, was assassinated in 1865. He had issued the greenbacks in 1862, legal tender bills of the federal government that did not depend on the private banking system. 3 days after his death, the private bank that controlled the American debt demanded that Congress repeal that system. The Federal Reserve, heir to that same private banking system, was created in 1913 by the same lineages that in 1865 had pressured for the repeal of the greenbacks. John F. Kennedy signed Executive Order 11,110 in June 1963, which returned to the American Treasury the power to issue silver certificates without going through the Federal Reserve. He was assassinated in November of that same year. The bills he ordered issued were withdrawn from circulation immediately after his death. In 2011, a team of scientists from the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich published in the magazine New Scientist a study on networks of global corporate control. They analyzed data from 37 million companies and investors to trace the ownership structures of 43,000 transnational corporations. Their conclusion was that 1,318 companies interconnected with one another controlled 60% of the global revenues of the real economy. And within that group, a super entity of 147 companies, mostly banks, controlled 40% of the entire network. Less than 1% of the companies controlled 40% of all the wealth in the network. Dr. James Glatfelder, one of the authors of the study, commented, "Reality is so complex that we must move away from dogma, whether that of conspiracy theories or that of the free market. Our analysis is based on reality." What the study did not examine were the family, social, business, and secret society relationships among the owners and shareholders of those 147 entities. That is the question that remains open. Former President Franklin D. Roosevelt said, "In politics, nothing happens by accident. If it happens, you can bet it was planned that way." British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli declared before the House of Commons in 1856, "It is useless to deny because it is impossible to conceal that a great part of Europe is covered by a network of these secret societies." Dennis Healey, Labour Defence Minister of the United Kingdom, formulated it more precisely. "World events do not happen by accident. They are created to happen, whether in national or commercial affairs, and most are organised and managed by those who control the purse strings." The journalist and strategist Fritz Springmeier, in his book Bloodlines of the Illuminati, identified 13 prominent families as the backbone of the modern organization: Astor, Bundy, Collins, DuPont, Freeman, Kennedy, Lee, Onassis, Rockefeller, Rothschild, Russell, Van Duyn, and Merovingian, with the Reynolds, Disney, Krupp, and McDonald families as satellites interconnected by marriage. What Springmeier claimed, and what historical records partially corroborate, is that these families have spent centuries using strategic marriages, adoptions, surname changes, and falsification of genealogical records to hide their real connections. David Rockefeller himself declared in his 2003 memoirs, referring to the accusations that he coordinated an international cabal working against the interests of the United States. "If that is the charge, I stand guilty and I am proud of it." At a Bilderberg meeting in 1991, according to leaked documents, Rockefeller added, "It would have been impossible for us to develop our plan for the world if we had been subject to the lights of publicity during those years." On May 1, 1776, 5 university students in Ingolstadt founded a fraternity. In less than 12 years, its doctrines had infiltrated the centers of power throughout Europe, contributed to bringing down the most powerful monarchy on the continent, and crossed the Atlantic to sow in the new United States of America symbols, institutions, and principles that are still recognizable today. The order was suppressed by decree in 1787. But the documents that the Bavarian police confiscated that year, and that are available in historical archives, show that its members did not disappear. They dispersed. They took the doctrine with them. And the doctrine, once implanted in the international Masonic architecture, in the financial networks of the Rothschilds, in the revolutionary movements of the 19th century, in the global institutions of the 20th century, stopped needing a formal organization in order to keep functioning. What Karl Theodor of Bavaria's decree suppressed in 1787 was a structure. What it could not suppress was an idea that a sufficiently small, sufficiently organized, sufficiently secret group with the right money and enough patience could control the course of historical events without the rest of humanity knowing it. The question of whether that idea is still operative today has the same answer it had in 1787. We cannot know for certain because if it were true, it would be designed exactly so that we could not know it. What we can know was left written by Adam Weishaupt himself in a letter addressed to the new leaders of the order. Do you understand what it means to govern? To govern in a secret society? Not only over the lesser or the most important of the people, but over the best among men, over men of all ranks, nations, and religions. To govern without external force, to unite them indissolubly, to breathe into them a single spirit and a single soul, men distributed throughout all parts of the world. Those words are 250 years old. They sound as if they had been written this morning.